Hey, welcome back. I'm coming to you today from the rapidly drying up Great Salt Lake in Utah, right by the city of the same name, Salt Lake City. And behind me you can see some expansive mudflats that are normally underwater about this time of year. You can see the snowpack on the mountains behind me, which provides the water to the Great Salt Lake. So why is it drying up? Why is it vanishing? What does it mean? Why should you care? What difference does it make? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So the Salt Lake is a really important economic feature for Utah. It contributes about $1.5 billion to the state economy from things like mineral resources that are mined locally in the Salt Lake and its deposits, brine shrimp farming and harvesting. These little tiny brine shrimp, which are an important part of the aquarium trade and feed for animals, are collected out of the Great Salt Lake. They breed here. The Great Salt Lake is also a really important ecological system. Those very same brine shrimp, along with the brine flies and a variety of beetles and small organisms that live in these mud flats in the lakeshore, provide essential nutrients to migrating birds like the snowy plover, which is really endangered. Now, habitat destruction across the world, and especially in the Gulf Coast of the US and parts of Alaska, have affected the snowy plover and other bird populations globally. These little birds migrate, and they use the Great Salt Lake as a stopping ground in springtime. So right about now, March, April, this place is typically teeming with small migratory birds that eat the brine shrimp and the beetles and the various little midges and brine flies. So drying up of the Salt Lake is really affecting these animals because the giant migrations that they undertake really depend on them being able to stop here and get food. If there's no food, they're going to starve, and that's been happening more and more. So why should we care aside from some birds and the economy? There's also a health issue, and the health issue here is in this Great Salt Lake, there's a whole lot of nasty chemical toxins like mercury and arsenic, things that are pretty bad for people's health. It's a combination of natural occurring minerals, but also stuff that's been introduced by human activity, industry. That stuff settles out in the lake bed, and normally it's forgotten about, except for when the lake bed starts to dry up. Come summertime, if this continues to dry up, all that material will be exposed as dust. You get some wind blowing through, all that nice arsenic, mercury, nasty stuff like that gets blown on the dust into Salt Lake City, where people like me with breathing problems, I got asthma, plenty of people have other breathing problems, can inhale that crap. It gets in their lungs and it causes lifelong problems potentially. So you've got a whole population at risk of major chronic breathing issues caused by toxins in the windblown dust. Here's some good evidence that the lake is definitely drier now than it was not long ago. These are big desiccation cracks or mud cracks, polygonal structures that form when the clays that are in the sediment start to contract and cause fracturing on the surface as water evaporates. This mud flat this time of year is normally under a couple of feet of water, and right now it's a big, expansive, desiccated, cracked up surface. In a couple of more months, it'll be dry, and a lot of this stuff will be blowing around in the air, and it'll be pretty nasty. Even though it looks like a pretty inhospitable place, life finds a way. The crinkly texture is because of microbial mats. You look, it's kind of got a little bit of a wrinkle texture on this mud flat. That's microbes that are making these little algal mats or microbial mats. These little mounds of dirt, these little mud balls, that's from burrowing insects. This is a variety of beetles. There's brine fly larvae. You can see some of the open burrows there. There's a couple. So these burrows represent the dwelling structures of little insects. Brine shrimp would be here if there was water, but there's not. So even in this really dry, desiccated, sad-looking mudflat, there's microbes on the surface, there's insects burrowing down below. There's a lot going on. We see the same thing in ancient deposits, and I've showed you some videos of those, but this kind of helps bring home that message of what did those environments look like back in the day. Okay, this is super cool. In amongst the algal microbial mat and the little burrows, there are also some little trails made by small insects. Those could be little beetles, probably some kind of beetle, it looks like, from seeing the little leg imprints in the trough in the middle. and it's hard to tell. It doesn't seem to end in that burrow. It seems to just keep on going. But there's fairly abundant life here on these mudflats. Looking at the climatic history of this area, and in fact North America in general, is an interesting story to be told. If you take a gander at the mountains behind me, you'll see there's some pretty pronounced ridges that go all the way across. Those ridges are actually ancient shorelines from when this lake was a lot bigger. It was a lot deeper, covered a lot more area. In fact, Salt Lake used to be part of what's called Lake Bonneville. And Lake Bonneville covered almost 1/4 or slightly more of Utah. It extended all the way into southern Utah, covered most of western Utah. At this point where I'm standing, the water would have been about 800 feet above my head. That's 250 meters. I would have been way, way underwater, 800 feet of water. Those horizontal lines on the mountain range behind me are shoreline deposits. Those are ancient shorelines of Lake Bonneville. When did that exist? Well, it existed a mere 15,000 years ago. When the first human beings arrived in North America, they would have seen a gigantic lake here, huge, monstrous lake, chock full of fresh water that was coming down from the mountains and the glaciers that were melting. So they would have been camped out on those shorelines with plenty of fish, fowl, all kinds of migratory animals did. And we know they did because we find a lot of their flint points and arrowheads and knives. So people made use of the resources here. Those resources started to change within the past 10,000 years when the lake levels started to drop. That's part of the longer term climate change that's been happening since the Pleistocene. There's no glaciers here anymore. They're gone. The glaciers that used to be here when there was mammoths and people eating fish melted, partly filled in the lake, but also as climate in Utah started to dry out, the lake waters began to evaporate. There was less runoff coming in, there was more evaporation of water leaving, so the lake started to dry up. And within the last 10,000 years, we lost 800 feet of water. That's phenomenal when you think about it. So the last few years, we've lost maybe a few inches, maybe a few feet of water every year. And right now it's accelerating. We're losing a lot of water, and that's primarily now because of extraction of water. So freshwater runoff in the various creeks and rivers is now being pulled out for agricultural use, industrial use, and domestic use of the growing population of Salt Lake City and surrounding areas. You remove water from the lake by evaporation. You don't allow it to replenish because you're removing it from the replenishing stream. It's a recipe for continual drop. So a calm and level-headed look at this lake tells you, well, we're just continuing a trend that started about 15 or 10,000 years ago. The lake just continues to drop. It's part of a natural cycle. The unnatural part is that anthropogenic climate change is contributing to some of the evaporation, but more importantly, some of the toxins that have been introduced to this lake are entirely our fault, and that's what's coming back to haunt us now in the wind. So there's a couple of ways of looking at the Great Salt Lake as sort of an analog for climate change and what's happening in the world in general right now. And there's two end members that people tend to kind of glom onto. One is that this is it, it's the end of the world, we're all gonna die, everything's coming to an end. The other is that, this is totally natural, it's part of a cycle that's been happening for millions of years, and certainly for the last 10,000 years. As with most things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Yes, absolutely, the lake was a lot bigger, it was 800 feet deeper here, it's been going down for 10,000 years or more, and it's gonna continue to go down. Nobody's arguing that. The problem is, a lot of the animals, like the birds that depend on it right now, have nowhere else to go. A lot of their habitat in the Gulf Coast and other areas has been degraded. So they really, really depend on this lake. The other thing is the health issue. We now have millions of people living in this area that didn't live here before, that are gonna be inhaling a lot of toxins that were not blowing around before. What are we gonna do about it? I visit here quite a lot, and my breathing last night when I stayed in Salt Lake, sure enough, was pretty bad. I had to use an inhaler. It's not the end of the world. All of Utah is not going to spontaneously combust and burst into flame and get destroyed because the lake level is dropping. But it's not perfectly natural and okay and normal either. So, like I say, as usual, things are somewhere in between. So that's the story of the Great Salt Lake. I hope you learned something. I hope you had a good time. I hope I didn't make you feel too bad and depressed about what's happening here at the lake. But at least you have maybe a little bit better understanding of what's been going on. And you'll be able to sort some of the hyperbole and some of the freaking out and some of the not freaking out from what's actually observable and what's actually been happening. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be back again next time from some outcrop, I promise.